Well, today's lecture is by David Smith. David Smith is very well known to members of the UNE community. He is a philosopher, but before I read his bio, he's a bon vivant. He likes ideas. He's a hybrid of American and European and other things besides. He likes good food and other things too. So David Livingston Smith is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of New England. Born in New York City, he spent much of his life in London, where he was director of the graduate program in psychotherapy at Regent's College. He earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of London, King's College, where he worked on problems in the philosophy of psychology. David has published widely on diverse topics, including deception and self-deception, Freud's philosophy of mind, the sociobiology of human incest avoidance, and war and human nature. His books include Freud's Philosophy of the Unconscious, published in 1999, Approaching Psychoanalysis, published in the same year, I suppose, Why We Lie, published in 2004, and The Most Dangerous Animal, published in 2007. He's currently completing a book on dehumanization, which will be published by St. Martin's Press later this year. David's work has also attracted attention in the national and international media, including Scientific American, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and National Public Radio. And I also need to say, though, that his books are incredible, they're wonderful to read. They're page turners, even though the topics and the themes seem to be heavy and ponderous. Whenever I read one of his books, they are an incredible treat, both intellectually and stylistically. So I'll leave you with David.
Thank you, Anouar, and thank you for that very generous introduction, and for inviting me to speak here. This is a very special occasion, and I wanted to prepare something very special for you. As a result, I've written something, so I hope you will forgive me for standing and reading. I know it can be somewhat alienating for a speaker to be there looking alternately from a piece of paper to the audience, but I hope you will bear with me, because I wanted to do something here which was not simply a quick and easy run-through of a set of ideas, but I wanted to present to you something in greater detail, and I wanted to give you also some insights into the new research I've been doing on this topic, which I have not yet presented elsewhere. So I'm going to speak on war and human nature. The British philosopher and public intellectual A.C. Grayling introduced his review of my book, The Most Dangerous Animal, with the following words. There is something deeply paradoxical about humanity. Look at a city and all the appurtenances of civilization it contains. Homes, businesses, schools and clinics, water supply, sewerage, transport, places of entertainment and recreation, art galleries, concert halls, sports fields, parks and gardens. To produce these things takes time, cooperation, stability, and the accumulation of resources. An anthropologist from another planet would infer from a modern city that its human occupants are rational and peaceable beings who work together for the common good in wonderfully sensible ways. The alien anthropologist would only be half right. Let the spaceship land on another day in another zone, a war zone, and the inference would be that mankind is lunatic, destructive, and dangerous. War is a chronic disease in mankind. Aggression and violence are endemic to human beings and the societies they form. Some of the greatest investment of the world's energy and resources goes into devising instruments of war and training millions of people to kill each other. This, then, is the paradox. Outside the peaceful and flourishing city is the barracks, where the soldiers drill, and the factory where the guns are made. Far beyond the horizon is the smoke and din of battle, where humans kill each other in horrifying ways, ways that, in the past 100 years alone, have resulted in nearly 200 million violent deaths. Grayling calls this the war-peace paradox. and I think it is a fitting way to introduce the subject of this talk. However, I would like to sharpen Grayling's depiction to highlight just how paradoxical our attitudes to war and peace really are. The coexistence of widespread cooperation with mass aggression would not be puzzling if there were two different sets of people involved. However, this is not the case. Individuals who participate in or explicitly or tacitly endorse mass violence are, by and large, the same as those who cooperate with their fellow human beings in peace. In fact, a moment's reflection reveals that characterizing the war-peace paradox in terms of violence versus cooperation does not do it justice. As Plato pointed out in The Republic, and more recently biologist Robert Bigelow argued in The Dawn Warriors, group aggression requires a high level of cooperation. Bigelow is scathing in his response to those who would neatly bifurcate human behavior into that which is cooperative and that which is aggressive. A hydrogen bomb, he writes, is an example of mankind's enormous capacity for friendly cooperation. I'll continue with his remarks. Its construction requires an intricate network of human teams, all working with single-minded devotion towards a common goal. Let us pause and savor the glow of self-congratulation we deserve for belonging to such an intelligent and sociable species. Without this high level of cooperation, no hydrogen bomb could be built. But without an equally high potential for ferocity, no hydrogen bomb ever would be built. We are without doubt the most cooperative and the most ferocious animals that have ever inhabited the earth. These considerations dissolve the apparent paradox. In-group cooperation does not conflict with out-group aggression, any more than the redness of an apple conflicts with its sweetness. But there's more here than mere logical incompatibility. War demands a high degree of cooperation. In a Hobbesian state of nature, where every individual is set against every other, war would be impossible. War requires cohesion. The more cohesive a military unit is, the more altruistically its members behave towards one another, the more deadly it becomes. Still, there's a different paradox waiting in the wings. There can be little doubt that we Homo sapiens have a penchant for collective violence. This side of human nature has been recognized from time immemorial. It was eloquently described by the elderly Sigmund Freud in one of his most mordant assessments of human nature. Writing in 1930 on the eve of the catastrophe which would condemn 3 of his sisters to the infernal ovens of Treblinka and a 4th to death by starvation in Theresienstadt, and cause him to flee as a refugee to the United Kingdom, Freud remarked that men are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love who simply defend themselves if they're attacked, but a powerful measure of desire for aggression has to be reckoned as part of their instinctual endowment. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to torture, and to kill him. Sadly, it is a truism to say that our history has been a bloody one. But it is equally true that we have a horror of violence. We condemn killing at least as avidly as we pursue it. This side of human nature is not given as much attention as the more demonic one. It is certainly not present in depictions of killing in popular media. In the movies, killing is easy. Soldiers blow away their enemies with little difficulty or remorse. This picture resembles the behavior of dangerous sociopaths more than it does the ordinary warrior. In reality, killing, especially when it's up close and personal, can be a deeply disturbing experience that torments one for an entire lifetime. Compare the casual bloodshed of motion pictures with the real impact of close combat. Soldiers may tremble, sometimes almost to the point of convulsion, losing bladder or bowel control, or sobbing uncontrollably. William Manchester gives a powerful description in Goodbye Darkness his memoir of serving in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Manchester recounts how he found a Japanese sniper entangled in his sniper harness. Their eyes met, he pulled the trigger, and continued pumping bullets into the corpse. Manchester writes, "A feeling of disgust and self-hatred clotted darkly in my throat, gagging me. Jerking my head to shake off the stupor, I slipped another fully loaded magazine into the butt of my .45. Then I began to tremble, and next to shake all over. I sobbed, in a voice still grainy with fear, 'I'm sorry.' Then I threw up all over myself. I recognized the half-digested C-ration beans dribbling down my front, smelled the vomit above the cordite. At the same time, I noticed another odor. I had urinated in my skivvies." Sometimes combatants don't get as far as pulling the trigger. The picaresque U.S. Army historian S.L.A. Marshall wrote in his classic 1947 book, Men Against Fire, that most of the riflemen that he interviewed in World War II had great difficulty firing their weapon, even when their lives were endangered, and many did not fire at all, or fired but aimed high. One infantry platoon leader recalled, "Squad leaders and platoon sergeants had to move up and down the firing line, kicking men to get them to fire." Our deep-seated reluctance to kill may throw light on the psychiatric sequelae of combat. Clinical psychologist Rachel McNair has found that there's a correlation between the type and intensity of psychiatric syndromes in the aftermath of combat and the experience of killing, or the belief that one has killed. Vets who know or believe that they have killed are especially prone to experience nightmares, flashbacks, and intrusive thoughts, as well as depersonalization, a sense of unreality, self-hatred, panic attacks, and feelings of disintegration. Killing can drive us crazy. Now, how can these facts be squared with our seeming passion for bloodshed and atrocity? How can these diverse and apparently contradictory poles of human nature be subsumed under a single explanation? One way to come to grips with how inhibitions against killing are overcome is to examine situations in which men kill with exuberance and abandon. One such circumstance is killing at a distance. Inhibitions against killing are particularly salient in close combat, but dropping bombs from an airplane, using long-range artillery, or operating an unmanned drone flying through Afghan airspace from a control center thousands of miles away insulates the killer from the consequences of his or her actions. Under these conditions, killing is not psychologically real. There are other circumstances in which men, and increasingly women, unleash lethal aggression against an enemy and do so without the benefit of physical distance. They do this by creating psychological, or better, moral distance between themselves and their targets. Let's examine 3 examples to see what can be learned from them. Example 1, the rape of Nanjing. In December 1937, for a period of 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers killed, mutilated, raped, and tortured thousands of Chinese civilians. The details are set out in Honda Kasiuchi's harrowing book, The Nanjing Massacre. A Japanese journalist confronts Japan's national shame. Kasiuchi lets both the perpetrators and the survivors speak for themselves. One former staff sergeant testified that, quote, "There was one who forced a pregnant woman to come along with him, stripped her naked, and drove a sword into her swollen belly. There was another who tied a woman hand and foot between 2 trees, stuffed a hand grenade up her vagina, and exploded it. The soldiers amused themselves by talking about the horrible things they had done to women." End of quote. Another sergeant confessed that because a woman's crying infant was interfering with his rape of her, he, quote, "took a living human child, an innocent baby that was just beginning to talk, and threw it into boiling water." End of quote. The mind reels at such horror. How can ordinary men do such things? Yoshio Tsuchiya, another Japanese veteran, tells us the answer. "We called the Chinese chankoro. That meant below human, like bugs or animals. The Chinese didn't belong to the human race. That was the way we looked at it. Suchia describes how he was ordered to bayonet unarmed Chinese civilians and what it was that enabled him to comply with this order. Quote, "If I thought of them as human beings, I couldn't have done it," he observed, "but I thought of them as animals or below human beings." Example 2, the Russian front. During the campaign against the Soviet Union, Hitler's Wehrmacht took the lives of 23 million Soviet citizens, roughly half of them civilians. It was a killing spree. In the words of Rutgers historian Omer Bartov, a campaign of murder and destruction which dispensed with all previous accepted norms of conduct. In the Nazi worldview, Russians were equated with Jews and were therefore thought of as Untermenschen, subhuman. This was driven home by a glossy magazine that hit German newsstands in the run-up to the invasion. Entitled The Subhuman and edited by Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, it was aimed at educating the German public about the alarming threat posed by, quote, mulattoes and Finn-Asian barbarians, gypsies and black-skinned savages, headed by the eternal Jew. Creatures that are beasts in human form. The text begins with a quotation from Himmler himself, dated 1935, which sets the tone for the pages to follow. Quote, "As long as there have been men on earth," he expounds, "the struggle between man and the subhuman will be the historic rule. The Jewish-led struggle against mankind, as far back as we can look, is part of the natural course of life on our planet. One can be convinced with full certainty that this struggle for life and death is just as much a law of nature as the struggle of an infection to corrupt a healthy body." He goes on to state, "Just as the night rises against the day, the light and dark are in eternal conflict. So too is the subhuman the greatest enemy of the dominant species on earth, mankind. The subhuman is a biological creature, crafted by nature, which has hands, legs, eyes, and mouth, even the semblance of a brain. Nevertheless, this terrible creature is only a partial human being. Not all of those who appear human are, in fact, so. Although it has features similar to a human, the subhuman is lower on the spiritual and psychological scale than any animal. Inside of this creature lies wild and unrestrained passions, an incessant need to destroy, filled with the most primitive desires, chaos, and cold-hearted villainy." There are 50 more pages of this stuff, accompanied by photographs of sinister-looking Jews and Russians, filthy hovels, desecrated churches, and piles of corpses to illustrate the mass atrocities that Jews are wont to commit. Illustrations of degradation are just juxtaposed with pictures of their wholesome Aryan counterparts. The illustrations have captions like "subhuman horde," "the mud huts of the subhuman," and "wanton murder by subhumans." As military historian Mary R. Habeck comments, quote, "Soldiers and officers thought of Russians and Jews as animals that had to perish. Dehumanizing the enemy allowed German soldiers and officers to agree with the Nazis' new vision of warfare and to fight without granting the Soviets any mercy or quarter." While the architects of the final solution were busy implementing their program of racial hygiene, the Russian Jewish poet and novelist Ilya Ehrenberg was composing propaganda for distribution to Stalin's Red Army, writing of the smell of Germany's animal breath, and describing Germans as two-legged animals who have mastered the technique of war, and ersatz men who should be annihilated. In a piece entitled "Kill," he wrote, "The Germans are not human beings. If you kill one German, kill another. There's nothing more amusing for us than a heap of German corpses. Do not count days, do not count miles. Count only the number of Germans you have killed. Kill the German. This is your old mother's prayer. Kill the German. This is what your children beseech you to do. Kill the German. This is the cry of your Russian earth. Do not waver. Do not let up. Kill." This wasn't idle talk. When the tide of war finally turned, a torrent of Russian forces poured into Germany from the east, and their inexorable advance became an orgy of rape and murder. Example 3, the Rwandan genocide. What is perhaps the most notorious genocide of the late 20th century exploded in Rwanda in 1994. The genocide was foreshadowed in popular media, principally the magazine Kangura, Awaken. A year before the genocide erupted, Kangura published a notorious article describing the Tutsi as vile subhuman creatures. Quote, "We began by saying that a cockroach cannot give birth to a butterfly. It is true. A cockroach gives birth to another cockroach. The history of Rwanda shows clearly that a Tutsi always stays the same, that he is never changed. The malice, the evil, are just as we knew them in the history of our country. We are not wrong in saying that a cockroach gives birth to another cockroach. Who could tell the difference between the Inyenzi, who attacked in October 1990, and those of the 1960s? They're all linked. Their evilness is the same. The unspeakable crimes of the Inyenzi today recall those of their elders, killing, pillaging, raping girls and women, etc. In the space of 3 months, around 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutus were shot, burned, hacked, and bludgeoned to death by marauding mobs. As the passage from Kangura indicates, Tutsis were called Inyenzi, cockroaches. Rakia Omar, director of the human rights organization Africa Rights, affirms that, quote, "In Rwanda, they referred to Tutsis as cockroaches. They were not human beings. They said, 'Don't worry, you're not killing humans like you. You're killing some vermin that belongs under your shoe. You're killing cockroaches,' which is," end of quote, which is why a secret military operation against the Tutsi had the code name Operation Insecticide. The Tutsi were also called rats, vermin, disease, snakes, sometimes weeds. Slogans like, "Tutsis cause problems and must be exterminated with their eggs. If you can't catch the louse, you kill its eggs. And if you set out to kill a rat, you must kill the pregnant rat," justified the murder of women and children. A woman who was raped during the genocide but managed to escape with her life and whose entire family was hacked to pieces is quite explicit about this. Based on what she saw, she told the historian Daniel Goldhagen, Hutu thought of Tutsi as animals. They did not have the value of a human being. You could pass some people and they shout at you saying, "Look at that cockroach, look at that snake." The killers confirmed this. One man who took part in the bloodbath informed Goldhagen that his comrades did not know that the Tutsi were human beings because if they had thought about it, then they wouldn't have killed them. He said, "Let me include myself as someone who accepted it. I wouldn't have accepted that they, the Tutsi, are human beings." These examples were not cherry-picked. I could equally well have used others. Although they're examples of 20th century carnage, the phenomenon that they illustrate is not uniquely modern. We find its telltale footprint in texts dating from the dawn of history. Nor is it uniquely Western. The tendency to dehumanize those whom we kill, torture, oppress, or enslave appears to be entrenched in our ways of thinking. There's an obvious reason why this should be. Dehumanizing others, considering them to be subhuman creatures, frees us from the burden of moral restraint. So dehumanization dissolves the war-peace paradox. If our enemies are subhuman creatures, we can exterminate them while sustaining a heartfelt opposition to taking human life. Explanatory puzzles have a way of proliferating. Solve one, and another quickly arises in its place. Now, having understood how dehumanization dissolves the war-peace paradox, we are left with the puzzle of dehumanization. Before I began studying dehumanization, I assumed that there was a substantial, if not enormous, scholarly literature on the topic. I was wrong. Apart from a small number of papers by social psychologists, there have been practically no effort by scholars to analyze dehumanization and identify the processes underpinning it. Given that dehumanization is widely acknowledged as a key factor in war, genocide, and other forms of human atrocity, its neglect by the academic community is nothing short of astonishing. Over the past five years, I've been working to develop a theory of dehumanization. It would exceed the limits of this presentation to set it out in detail. So I will confine myself to just one aspect of it. And even here, I must of necessity give you a highly condensed account, gesturing at an analysis rather than spelling it out in full. The word dehumanization entered the English language early in the 19th century. From the outset, it had many meanings, and this is still true today. Have a look at articles in the popular press or in scholarly journals, and you will read that automatic ticketing machines in airports dehumanize customers by turning them into cattle, that pornography dehumanizes women, that triathlons dehumanize athletes, that technology dehumanizes education, and that the treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay dehumanizes them. Given this unruly tangle of meanings, anyone who writes about dehumanization should explain what they take the word to mean. In this, I will follow Abraham Lincoln's lead in his final debate with Stephen Douglas. The 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates revolved around the issue of slavery. Douglas openly argued that when the Founding Fathers proclaimed that all men were created equal, they used the word men to refer to white men, and that slavery ought therefore to be permitted in the new territories of the American West. Lincoln disagreed. He told Douglas that he displayed, quote, the tendency to dishumanize the man, end of quote, or in some reports, dishumanize the Negro, and thus, quote, take away from him all right to be supposed or considered as human, end of quote. When the New York Tribune published Lincoln's speech, the editors changed his awkward dishumanize to the more elegant dehumanize. Now, it is all good and well to say that when we dehumanize people, we regard them as less than human creatures. But this analysis is little more than a promissory note unless one can specify what exactly it entails. To do this, I would like to begin by describing a sort of folk metaphysics. Since ancient times, people have been inclined to conceive of the cosmos as a vast hierarchy with God, the supremely perfect being, sitting astride its apex, inanimate matter lying at its base, and everything else situated at one or another of the many levels in between. Although the details are different from culture to culture and from one historical epoch to the next, all versions are broadly similar. Plants are near the bottom of the metaphysical ladder, not much higher than the soil from which they grow. Simple animals like worms and snails are more perfect than plants, so they occupy a slightly higher rung. Mammals are higher still, and we humans have a privileged niche close to God. This taxonomic system is called the Great Chain of Being, the Scala Naturae, literally ladder of nature. Quote, the mighty chain of being lessening down from infinite perfection to dreary nothing, as Alexander Pope put it in the 18th century. The Great Chain wasn't just a classificatory tool. It was supposed to represent the structure of the universe. Unlike modern scientific models, which are purely descriptive, the Great Chain of Being provided a moral framework as well. Beings near to the top of the hierarchy were considered to be more worthy than things lower down, because they are closer to God. Each level of the chain was thought to contain its own hierarchy of sublevels and sub-sublevels. For instance, in the category of metals, itself a subcategory of inanimate substances, gold was considered the most noble and lead the most base. So the former belonged at the top of the hierarchy of metals, while the latter was assigned a place at the bottom. In the social sphere, the king was at the top, while peasants were at the bottom. The stratification of sublevels sparked a great deal of speculation about the relative superiority or inferiority of different types of human beings, and the relationship between human types and subhuman animals. The 12th century philosopher Albertus Magnus, aka Saint Albert the Great, added a category of similitudiens hominis, creatures similar to man, situated between humans and animals. It included apes and pygmies. Later on, Enlightenment scholars discarded Albert's innovation and divided the human level into a series of sublevels that ranked human races from highest to lowest, modestly placing Caucasians at the pinnacle and relegating Native Americans and Sub-Saharan Africans to the bottom, only a hair's breadth away from the apes. an idea that underpinned Thomas Jefferson's infamous claim that apes preferred African women to members of their own species as mates. Scientifically, the scheme is nonsense. Over 150 years ago, Darwin replaced the vertical model of biodiversity with a more egalitarian horizontal one. He denied that life progresses towards a goal of perfection and asserted instead that it simply diversifies, branching outward rather than climbing upward. Nonetheless, we still talk about higher and lower animals, and the idea that we are more highly evolved than other organisms continues to suffuse the zeitgeist. Even our scientific categories retain a connection with this ancient pre-scientific model of the universe. The word primate, which refers to the order of animals that includes Homo sapiens, comes from the Latin primas, which means of the highest rank. Perhaps we still cling to the idea of an ordered cosmic hierarchy because, status-obsessed primates that we are, we cannot help unconsciously projecting onto the cosmos the socially stratified character of human societies, with their hierarchies of wealth, class, and power. Or perhaps it is because moral values would disappear if we denied that some beings have greater intrinsic worth than others. I suppose even the most ardent animal rights activist must admit that the life of a human being is more precious than that of an earthworm or a potato. Whatever the reason, the principle that some lives have greater value than others is central to our worldview. It's also indispensable to the notion of dehumanization. For the very notion of subhumanity, of being less than human, depends upon it. It is only in the context of the great chain of being that dehumanization becomes intelligible. When we dehumanize others, we demote them to a lower rung on the cosmic ladder. Although ostensibly human, those on the receiving end of the dehumanizing impulse are conceived to be a different, less worthy sort of creature. But this, too, is perplexing. How is it possible for a being that is physically indistinguishable from humans to be anything but human? The answer lies in another feature of folk metaphysics. It's essentialism. The Roman Catholic Mass, more specifically the Miracle of Transubstantiation, illustrates the point rather well. In the Mass, bread and wine are miraculously transformed into the body and blood of Christ. The bread and wine do not symbolize Christ, they are Christ. The Eucharist is conceived as a theophagic act. But how can things that look, smell, and taste exactly like bread and wine be the body and blood of Jesus? To explain this, the Church drew on the Aristotelian distinction between the appearance of a thing and its essence. The idea is roughly as follows. There is something about everything that makes it the kind of thing that it is. This is called its essence. Things also possess more superficial characteristics which can be modified or lost without changing what the thing is. These are called accidental properties, properties a thing just happens to have but which it doesn't need to have. I will call them appearances. In the Mass, then, the substances consumed appear to be bread and wine, but their essence is that of God's flesh and blood. There's something about the human mind that makes essentialism almost irresistible. In recent years, cognitive anthropologists have demonstrated that people the world over make a basic distinction between how things seem and how they really are. Developmental researchers have found that children do so too from quite a young age. Mounting evidence suggests that essentialistic thinking is part of our cognitive design. Philosophers have done quite a bit of thinking about essences, but before I delve into their ideas, I need to introduce a notion that plays a prominent role in the discussion: the concept of natural kinds. To get a handle on it, imagine that there are several pieces of jewelry spread out on a table in front of you. There are rings and brooches, pendants, bracelets, and earrings. Now, some of these are made of silver, and some of them are made of gold. Further, imagine that you're asked to arrange these pieces of jewelry into groups on the basis of what kind of things they are. There are lots of ways you might perform this task. One way to do it would be to put all the earrings in one pile, all the bracelets in another, all the brooches in a third, and so on, making 5 piles in all. Another method would be to make just 2 piles, one for all the gold jewelry and another for all the silver jewelry. Obviously, the choice of one method or another depends on the sort of classification scheme you find most appealing. It's not that one is right and the other is wrong. The choice of a classification scheme is just a matter of how you want to cut the pie. Suppose you use the first method. You'd be dividing the jewelry into categories based on what they're used for. Philosophers call these artificial kinds because they pertain to human artifice rather than real divisions out there in nature. They are, so to speak, classifications of convenience. But if you perform the task in the second way, putting all the gold jewelry into one pile and all the silver into another pile, you would be classifying them as natural kinds, as kinds of things that exist objectively in nature, independent of our taxonomic practices. Let's dig a little deeper. Suppose that one of the earrings was made from white gold, and because the earring looked like silver, you placed it in the silver pile. If you had done that, you would have made a mistake, because something's being gold or silver isn't determined by how it looks. Objects belong in the gold category only if they are made from atoms with atomic number 79. And those that fall into the silver category must have atomic number 47. Atomic numbers define the essence of gold and silver. This has the startling implication that centuries ago, before the advent of modern chemistry, nobody knew what gold and silver were. Of course, they could distinguish between gold objects and silver objects, and got it right most of the time, but they didn't know what it was about these things that made them gold or silver. However, even in those far-off days, people suspected that there was a hidden something that determined whether an object was made of gold, silver, or some other substance. The medieval alchemists, the intellectual ancestors of today's chemists, spoke of the souls of metals. The soul or essence of a metal was supposed to be something distinct from its appearance or body, something that made it the kind of metal that it is. Interestingly, the alchemists saw this as analogous to the soul or essence of a human being. The Polish alchemist Michael Sendigovius, for one, made this point quite explicitly in a tract entitled The New Chemical Light. He wrote, "The bodily nature of things is a concealing outward vesture. If you dressed a boy and a girl of 12 years of age in exactly the same way, you would be puzzled to tell which was the boy and which was the girl. But when the clothes are removed, they may be easily distinguished. In the same way, our understanding makes a shadow to the shadow of nature. For our human nature is concealed by the body in the same way as the body by the clothes." The notion of the soul of gold, or any other natural kind, functioned as a placeholder for a mysterious unknown. Although Sendigovius's text dates from the early modern period, it expresses a view that originated in antiquity, or even in prehistory, reflecting, as it does, our seemingly innate and irrepressible tendency to believe in essences. The 17th century English philosopher John Locke wrote one of the most influential discussions of natural kinds and their essences, one that is still discussed today. Locke speculated in his monumental Essay on Human Understanding that members of natural kinds have an unobservable real essence that accounts for their observable properties. He illustrated the point with a gold ring. "The particular parcel of matter," Locke wrote in his characteristically tortuous literary style, "which makes the ring I have on my finger by most men supposed to have a real essence, whereby it is gold. This real essence is distinct from the ring's peculiar color, weight, hardness, fusibility, fixedness, and change of color upon a slight touch of mercury." But it explains why the ring has these features. He goes on to conjecture that the real essence of gold must be located in its microscopic structure. This essence, from which all these properties flow, when I inquire into it and search after it, I plainly perceive that I cannot discover. The furthest I can go is only to presume that it being nothing but body, its real essence or internal constitution on which these qualities depend, can be nothing but the figure, size, and connection of its solid parts, of neither of which having any distinct perception at all, I can have any idea of its essence. Today we marvel at Locke's prescience. Although he couldn't have known that the stuff his ring was made from had atomic number 79, he knew that there must be something about it that made it gold. Like the alchemists before him, Locke applied the same general pattern of reasoning to human beings. This is Locke. First, it is usual for men to make the names of substances stand for things as supposed to have certain real essences, whereby they are of this or that species. Who is there almost who would not take it amiss if it should be doubted whether he called himself a man with any other meaning than of having the real essence of a man? And yet if you demand what those real essences are, it is plain that men are ignorant and know them not. Now, essentialistic thinking works for chemical kinds like gold and silver, but it does not work for biological species. There is no hidden essence that makes something a dog or a cat or a human being. Indeed, one of Darwin's greatest achievements was to show that species are not discontinuous packages, but merge with one another through intermediate forms. And this is where our instinctive essentialism leads us astray. If we are not careful, it's easy to become entangled in the belief that each kind of organism, including Homo sapiens, contains a hidden something, a soul, if you will, that makes it the kind of creature that it is. And it is this that accounts for its superficial attributes, just as the atomic structure of a gold ring underpins its color, weight, and malleability. This way of thinking opens the door to the possibility that essence and appearance can come apart. That is, a creature can have the appearance of humanity but lack the human essence. Just as fool's gold may look very much like gold while lacking its chemical essence, so subhumans can look very much like humans while lacking their human essence. They are, so to speak, counterfeit humans. It's not surprising, then, that the discourse of dehumanization typically involves the idea that members of a certain population are not what they appear to be. This is usually implicit, but sometimes it is quite overt. In Himmler's magazine, The Subhuman, Jews are portrayed as beasts in human form, even though they have, quote, features similar to a human, end of quote. They may look like humans and act like them, but inside, where it matters, they are not like humans at all. This way of thinking comes naturally to us. We find it very easy to imagine that a being can appear human while lacking a human core. Take the idea of demonic possession. To conceive of demonic possession, you have to accept that a human being can inhabit, that a non-human being can inhabit a human body, that someone can be outwardly human but inwardly demonic. Of course, belief in demons is a primitive superstition, but the idea is a very compelling one. Films like The Exorcist, one of the biggest grossing and scariest films ever made, demonstrate that it strikes a deep chord even in educated contemporary audiences. Zombies are another example. Zombies are animate human bodies without souls, shells of human beings with nothing inside. The lifelike robots that are standard fare in science fiction are sophisticated versions of zombies. The Terminator is easy to mistake for a person, but there's nobody inside him. He's a humanoid, not human. If I'm right, when one group of people dehumanizes another, they imagine that although the latter may look human, in the idiom of the subhuman, they have hands, legs, eyes, and mouth, even the semblance of a brain, they lack that inner spark that only humans possess. Not all of those who appear human are in fact so, the subhuman warns. Woe to him who forgets it. If subhumans are not really human, then what are they? This brings us to the sub in subhuman. They are beings that have the essence of a lesser entity, typically dangerous predator, poisonous animal, carrier of disease or disease organism, parasite, traditionally filthy animal or bodily product, especially feces. In the subhuman, they are described as a vector of infection first. Then, a bit later, they are pictured as nocturnal animals living in fetid environments. Quote, "The subhuman is united with his peers, like beasts among beasts, never knowing peace or calm. The subhuman thrives in chaos and darkness. He's frightened by the light. These subhuman creatures dwell in the cesspools and swamps, preferring a hell on earth to the light of the sun. But in the swamps and cesspools, the subhuman has found its leader, the eternal Jew." The text also hints at their predatory characteristics by mentioning their wild and unrestrained passions and their incessant need to destroy. Dehumanization does not always conform to the specific patterns that I have just described, although they are the most common ones. Sometimes dehumanized people are thought of as domestic animals, as when the Sudanese Janjaweed referred to black Darfurians as donkeys, or as monkeys, baboons, or apes, as the German and Dutch colonists in Namibia called the Herero and Nama, whom they slaughtered in the first genocide of the 20th century. Very occasionally, they're portrayed as invasive or undesirable plants, for example, when Hutus called Tutsis weeds. Because the subhuman condition is determined by one's essence, it is typically thought to be a permanent condition. Subhumans can't become humans any more than frogs can become princes. As the text of Himmler's The Subhuman puts it, the subhuman will always be a subhuman. Belief in the unchangeability of the subhuman condition is linked to another assumption. Subhumanity is thought to be inherited, passed down by parents to their offspring. Even innocuous infants carry the dangerous subhuman essence within them. The principle nits make lice was invoked to justify the murder of Native American children along with their parents, and Rwandan Hutus adopted slogans like, "You must kill the pregnant rat," as an injunction to murder pregnant Tutsi women. Often, the subhuman essence is imagined to be carried in the blood. The notion of blood purity had an obvious bearing on one of the fundamental problems confronting the Nazi program of racial hygiene. It was vital for the Nazis to find some way to reliably distinguish subhumans from humans. During the 1930s, German biologists launched a research program with the aim of discovering the distinctive traits in subhuman blood. The abject failure of these efforts caused Hitler to reorient his racial policy. From that point on, remarks Duke University historian Claudia Kuntz, the burden of proof shifted away from the natural sciences to the social sciences and the humanities. The new race experts were literary and legal scholars, linguists, historians, geographers, and anthropologists, rather than physicians and biologists. As Hitler admitted in a letter dictated to Martin Bormann, we use the term Jewish race merely for reasons of linguistic convenience. For in the real sense of the word, and from a genetic point of view, there is no Jewish race. The Jewish race is above all a community of the spirit, presenting sad proof of the superiority of the spirit over the flesh. The historical examples that I have offered this evening might lead you to assume that dehumanization is no longer a force to be reckoned with, and that it poses no danger for us here and now. So, before concluding, let me say a few words about dehumanizing rhetoric in contemporary culture. Although dehumanization seems to come naturally to us, it can also be aroused, exacerbated, and exploited by propaganda. It is common knowledge that prior to and during the 1994 genocide, government radio broadcasts characterized Rwandan Tutsis as cockroaches, and that Nazi Germany had a massive propaganda apparatus that was largely devoted to painting horrifying pictures of Jews and other supposedly racially inferior groups. Now let's look a little bit closer to home. On September 4th, 2007, the Columbus Post-Dispatch published a cartoon portraying Iran as a sewer, with a swarm of cockroaches pouring out of it. The subtext was obvious. "I find it extremely troubling that your paper would behave like Rwandan Hutu papers that also publish cartoons depicting human beings as cockroaches," responded one reader, calling for them to be stamped out, leading to genocide. While another wrote, "Depicting Iranians as cockroaches spewing out of a sewer was a vile slur on the Iranian people. Cartoons like this only caused the neoconservative drums of war sounding for a disastrous military attack against Iran to beat louder." 3 years earlier, when the Abu Ghraib scandal became public, Rush Limbaugh, the most popular radio broadcaster in the United States with over 13 million listeners, described the prisoners who had been killed, raped, tortured, and humiliated by or at the behest of U.S. military personnel as less than human. "They are the ones who are sick," fumed Limbaugh. "They are the ones who are perverted. They are the ones who are dangerous. They are the ones who are subhuman. They are the ones who are human debris, not the United States of America, and not our soldiers, and not our prison guards." Limbaugh's view of the detainees was shared by members of the U.S. military establishment and, presumably, the men and women who abused them. Brigadier Brigadier General Janice Karpinski was the commander of Abu Ghraib at the time. She later disclosed that Major General Jeffrey Miller, the man in charge of the military prison at Guantanamo Bay, had told her to make sure that the prisoners were treated like subhuman animals. Quote, "He said they're like dogs, and if you allow them to believe at any point that they're more than a dog, then you've lost control over them." End of quote. Michael Savage, the pseudonym of Michael Allen Weiner, another immensely popular radio host whose syndicated program is followed by 8 to 10 million listeners, I left off the verb in that sentence. Like Limbaugh, Savage derided the detainees as subhuman and vermin, and suggested that forcible conversion to Christianity is, quote, "probably the only thing that can turn them into human beings," end of quote. And in words uncannily reminiscent of Adolf Hitler's diatribes against the Jews, Neil Bortz characterized Islam as, quote, "a deadly virus spreading through Europe and the West," end of quote, adding, "we're going to wait far too long to develop a vaccine to find a way to fight this." Perhaps it's not surprising that Limbaugh, Bortz, Savage, and their ilk indulge in dehumanizing rhetoric from time to time. But this sort of talk is not confined to right-wing populism. It is well represented in the mainstream media by journalists of all political stripes. To give just one example, Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd wrote in a 2003 editorial, "We want to get rid of Osama and Saddam and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We didn't. They're replicating and coming at us like cockroaches. Dehumanization makes strange bedfellows." Further evidence can be found in newspaper headlines dealing with the war on terror. Propaganda researchers Erin Streuter and Deborah Willis note in their book At War with Metaphor that, quote, "The symbolic lexicon used by news media since 9/11 demonstrates a clear pattern. Suspected terrorists, enemy military and political leaders, and ultimately entire populations are metaphorically linked to animals, particularly to prey. This holds true both nationally and internationally. Headlines of newspapers of many political affiliations across the US, Europe, and Australia generate, with remarkable consistency, this journalistic framing of the enemy as hunted animal. Most frequently, enemies are identified with the lower order animals, conventionally regarded as especially noxious. Media reports of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are punctuated by language expressing notions of pursuit, capture, and entrapment, via a particular vocabulary that relies on animal metaphors such as hunt, trap, snare, net, and corral. Terrorists are caught in a trap while the enemy scurries for cover or slithers out of reach. Neutral terms such as search or look for have been almost entirely replaced by the dominant hunt model, as in repeated references to the hunt for terrorists. Before closing, let's look at this in a bit more detail. Sometimes the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are presented as hunting expeditions, and I'll intersperse this with some example newspaper headlines. As British close in on Basra, Iraqis scurry away. Terror hunt snares 25, and net closes around bin Laden. With enemy bases as animal nests, Pakistanis give up on lair of Osama, and terror nest in Fallujah is attacked, from which the quarry must be driven out. Why bin Laden is so difficult to smoke out. America's new dilemma, how to smoke bin Laden out from caves. The idea is to trap the animal. Trap may net Taliban chief. FBI terror sting nets mosque leaders, and confine it to a cage. Even locked in a cage, Saddam poses serious danger. Sometimes the enemy is a ravening predator, chained beast, shackled Saddam dragged to court, or a monster, the terrorism monster of monsters and Muslims. At other times, he's a pesky rodent. Americans cleaned out rat's nest in Afghanistan, Hussein's rat hole. A venomous snake, the viper awaits. Former Arab power is poisonous snake. An insect, Iraqi forces find hornet's nest in Fallujah. Operation Desert Pest. Terrorists like rats and cockroaches skulk in the dark. Or a disease organism, Al-Qaeda mutating like a virus. Only Muslim leaders can remove spreading cancer of Islamic terrorism. In any case, they reproduce at an alarming rate. Iraq breeding suicide killers, continent a breeding ground for radical Islam. Our enemies aren't just wicked, they're not even human. You may think I'm making far too much of these examples, that I'm leaping upon mere figures of speech and inflating them beyond all recognition. Surely these are just metaphors and don't imply that anyone is subhuman, but they're not just metaphors. They express something deeper, something very important to understand. Thinking of a person as subhuman is not the same as calling them names. Merely calling someone a rat or a cockroach is an act of verbal aggression, an effort to hurt them. It's a way of saying to a person that they are repulsive, despised, or unwanted. But dehumanizing a person means thinking of them as less than human. When the Nazis called Jews Untermenschen, this wasn't intended to hurt them. If the Holocaust had been an exercise in name-calling, the history of the 20th century would have been far less bloody. Given the time available to me this evening, I've been able to give you only a small taste of the evidence supporting my claims about the pervasiveness of the dehumanizing impulse and its role in war and other forms of collective violence. Furthermore, I've been able to do little more than gesture towards an analysis of how the process of dehumanization works. But I hope I have succeeded in stimulating your curiosity about our constructions of humanity and subhumanity and their part in the agony and devastation that we regularly visit upon our own species. I'm happy to take questions.
Let's make sure we use microphones on each side. So.
This is a personal and very unscientific question. But first of all, I should preface it by saying I really enjoyed the book and learned a lot. And it was very eye-opening. What is your opinion on the peace movements and Peace Action Maine and what, after reading your book, I feel like we should be doing something. But I just wanted to get your comments on peace movements throughout the U.S. and if you think they're necessary, relevant, that sort of thing.
Any movement towards peace, I think, is a good thing. I think it's very important for people who are genuinely interested in peace to understand what they're dealing with, understand the forces, not only the social forces, but the forces in human nature which make peace difficult to achieve. So I suppose my comment is those who are genuinely interested in peace should become interested in war, violence, and all these more horrible sides of human nature that they're trying to deal with. Otherwise, how can you possibly disarm these tendencies if you don't know what you're dealing with?
Thank you, of course, for a very interesting talk. I've started to read your book and haven't gotten through it all yet, and I recognized a few things from there that you mentioned tonight. I guess I want to ask about a perspective on the research that you've presented. And my question comes from my own training as a sociologist rather than a psychologist, and more from reading Marx than from reading Freud. It seems obvious that the kinds of things you've described are based in human biology and genetics, that this is something we are, this is a potentiality that we have, and it's a malleability that we have, which can be manipulated under circumstances and make it difficult to get out of wars, make it easier to get into wars. That if soldiers believe the other side is vermin, you don't have to kick them in the pants as much to make them fire their rifles.
Yeah.
I don't think that this really explains why wars start. And I wondered if you have some thoughts about, to make the example a little clearer, Germany didn't go to war with Russia because they thought they needed to exterminate a lower race. This idea came along after Hitler had decided this was important for German survival. So Where do we go next in looking at the causes of war as well as our delight in them?
Oh, well, I think war is a very complex subject. And the reason I chose to investigate war in human nature is simply there's very, very little literature on this, surprisingly. There are tens of thousands of books on the American Civil War alone, and very little of this looks at this war or any other war as a human phenomenon. And wars are causally complex, and we need to take into consideration geopolitical concerns and economic concerns and complex historical concerns and so on and so forth. In my own view, and I'm by no means anything even remotely approaching an expert on the causes of war, my own view is war is theft. I mean, we go to war primarily to steal stuff from other people.
Thank you. That was so fascinating. And I haven't yet gotten to read the book, so forgive me if this is in the book. I'm wondering if there's anything to be gained by looking to see if there's sort of an equal and opposite mechanism or process that we experience when we, in terms of how we elevate some people, right? You know, we have dehumanization, but do we superhumanize or
Yes.
adore or glorify or worship? Because, you know, we do that in such a cooperative way, right? Just like we dehumanize in a cooperative way. And is there something?
That's an extremely good question, and it is something that I do not address in the book. But I think it's an important point. What's going on in dehumanization is that there's a difference created. So if we retain our status as human beings and we knock down the enemy's status to that of the subhuman, there's a distance which makes the enemy then not our moral equals, and then that unleashes our inhibitions against aggression, or dissolves our inhibitions against aggression, softens them. But there's another way you can go. That is, you can elevate yourself above the human. You can see yourself as I mean, the usual formula is divinely protected or divinely guided. And this you find a lot more in ancient warfare, that the warriors conceive of themselves as kind of participating in the divine forces represented by the emperor, the leader, the chieftain, etc. And that creates the required differential. So that's a really good question.
Except I was thinking more of how we elevate ourselves in that instance. You know, where we are having a mandate, right, from on high.
Yes. And
but what
every
about
bit helps.
how we elevate others? You know, how we take a celebrity or a figure, a religious leader or a cult leader or something, and make them sort of more, you know, that we have that capacity not only to stomp
here's
down,
what
but
I'd say
to
about this, putting on my old Freudian hat here. We're all looking for salvation, and we're all prone to illusions of salvation. And we churn out gods in human form as well as in non-human form to try and secure that for ourselves. And once we've churned one out, of course, they will have an extraordinary influence over our own thinking and behavior.
I wonder how you equate your ideas about war and human nature to racism in our country, because a lot of what you said makes me think, you know, about the history of racism and how it continues as a systemic force. It's certainly, you certainly said a lot about the dehumanizing aspects of war, and I see that acted out even today. So I'm curious about what your thinking is about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something I'm addressing in detail in the book I'm writing now. I mean, race, as is conventionally understood, is a special case of creating these human kinds with essences. The actual categories have really flexible boundaries. 100 years ago, Italians were considered a race, and Irish were considered a race, and so on and so forth. And much the same, racist language that was used 50 years later to talk about African Americans was at that time applied equally to Eastern Europeans, Irish, and Italians. So we do have this propensity to discriminate humankind on the basis of attributing a hidden, immutable essence to them, and also to discriminate quasi-humankinds or subhumankinds. So racism is part of this whole general phenomenon. It's really not at all distinct.
David, I was wondering, women just joined the front lines not too long ago, probably in the last decade, and still are not, serving on some like subs. Has that added anything to the equation here as far as, how we're conducting ourselves?
Well, women now have the opportunity to destroy their souls too. I mean, to suffer the horrible consequences of war. We grossly underestimate the psychological and spiritual consequences of war. We really, really, really do. We grossly underestimate the burdens that people who go to war carry, people particularly who have been engaged in combat. And we think that just this hype about heroism and this sort of stuff can somehow magically relieve these burdens. Other cultures were more intelligent. Many cultures, including the ancient Romans, required returning warriors to go through rituals of purification because they recognized that there was a stain of blood on them. In other words, they recognized this burden that comes through doing violence to one's nature, one's inhibitions against killing members of one's own kind, which is half of the equation. Even in medieval Europe, even in officially religiously endorsed wars, returning knights had to do penance, sometimes a year's penance, to remove that burden. Here, we just say rah, 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 the heroes, or we have this PTSD industry, which treats these terrible crushing burdens as though they are diseases that can be readily cured. So, a somewhat, I guess, cynical response, all these opportunities for horror have been opened up to women now as well.
I want to ask you one very focused theoretical question about your paradigm, the way that you're trying to analyze this really fascinating problem, and then a really broad question. So the first question, you probably know that in literary theory and theories about identity, one of the shifts that has happened is from trying to think outside of the model of essence, and I'm going to use Saussure and the linguistic model just because it's kind of helpful boil-down model, which you probably understand, but Saussure points out that we understand the meaning of language because not just because of the essence of the word, but because of its difference from other things. So a dog is a dog, not just because it looks like a dog, but because it's not a cat and it's not a horse. And in the model that you described, it seems like you're looking primarily at sort of one relation between, let's say, the more aggressive party against the dehumanized party, and theorizing about how the essence of the dehumanized party is imagined or distorted. And I'm wondering if it would be helpful to think also about how the satisfactions of that kind of distortion are also related to the identification with, let's say, among the Hutus. It's not just that the Tutsis are dehumanized cockroaches, but that they are not Tutu, and Jews are not just Jews, they're non-Aryan.
Yes. Oh, sure.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, but whenever, strictly speaking, whenever you attribute an essence, this essence is supposed to supply necessary and sufficient conditions for the identity of the thing. That means it includes everything that belongs and excludes everything else. So when we're talking about essences, we're talking about both vectors there. We're talking about what makes things hang together and what differentiates them from everything else.
But if what's puzzling to us is why we dehumanize one group, one way of understanding it is that it reinforces one's sense of identification with the non-dehumanized group, and there's a kind of obvious enjoyment, pleasure, investment in that kind of thing.
I don't think that's going to work because it's quite possible. I mean, there's a lot of research on in-group and out-group biases and attitudes, and it's not a necessary consequence of of in-group solidarity to dehumanize an out-group. That's something extra. There are certain biases that come with in-group solidarity. We tend to judge people by a double standard. For instance, we tend to see the out-group as less heterogeneous than the in-group and so on, but it falls well short of dehumanization.
And then my really broad question is just about representation and popular culture, because you touched on that regularly, and I don't know if you want to talk more about that. That was a really compelling catalog you offer at the end of the talk about just journalistic language.
I guess all I can say is there's a lot of it. I mean, no one has pulled all this stuff together. It's very scattered, but there are just remarkable resources for looking at these sorts of representations of human beings in popular culture as well as more esoteric areas.
Tim, you want to ask a question?
Well, I was actually going to ask a question until all these hands went up over here, and I thought it probably wasn't necessary. But since I've got the microphone, fabulous talk, David. Thank you. I'm coming from the perspective, the philosophy of considering all humans to be animals, and yet, your argument is that we have something unique. We can't learn anything at all from animal behavior. Is that absolutely true? Are there any examples?
That's not my argument at all.
I mean, I of course, don't really study animals. I study bacteria, and I see a lot of parallels between human behavior and the behavior of pathogenic organisms.
No, I'm a philosophical naturalist. We are animals. Of course we are. We're organisms, and all organisms have profound similarities. What's important, though, is we tend not to think of ourselves that way, and that's part of what drives this dehumanizing impulse. If we look at the history of the terminology, it's really interesting. Before about 17th century, the word animal was inclusive of human beings. When Aristotle said that human beings are political animals, he wasn't doing anything funny with words. He thought that animal was the genus and human was the species. After the 17th century, the terminology shifted, and then animal and human became juxtaposed. So when people talk about the enemy as an animal, they're using this kind of post-17th century construction of animal versus human. No, these sorts of things, this is pure fantasy. I mean, when we imagine ourselves as having some kind of divine spark that provides us with some special essence of what we are, and that this differentiates us from everything else, that is scientifically it's utter nonsense. In fact, work in philosophy of biology shows pretty clearly that there are a few dissenters to this, but it's generally accepted that there's no such thing as a species essence. There's nothing definite that sets one species apart from another.
Hi, David. I have a question about, do you look in your current research into sports at all? And I'm thinking of more violent sports like football or ultimate fighting or boxing. Because I remember my football coaches when I played in high school, they described the game as an organized war. And there was kind of the sense of, you're out to kill the other team. And, and when you hit somebody, you're driving through the man. I remember, the kind of description was very, very violent. I'm just curious if you've looked into that.
I haven't done any work in that area, but I know people who are doing work in that area.
You mentioned PSTD, and I'm curious if you're aware of any studies that show that distancing results in less PSTD than...
Yeah. You want to go, there's hardly any, because, and I think one of the reasons for that is that, oddly, and this I think reveals a great deal about our attitudes, people don't consider killing in war. They don't consider it as a psychologically significant event. You need to go to I think Rachel McNair is the only psychologist working on this. And her research success, there's quite a definite correlation.
Yeah, I mean, intuitively it would seem to be the case. I was just wondering if it was too new, but apparently.
It's just, look, we don't like to, it's very, very, Bertrand Russell noted this a long time ago. We talk about people going off and giving their lives for their country. Well, we miss the point that they're going off taking lives for their country. We just don't like this idea. And this casts a kind of a cloak of avoidance over a lot of features of war, which really need to be understood. For the benefits of those who partake in it, it needs to be understood.
David, I'm curious about not only the war in human nature, but the sport in human nature that was just mentioned. It seems to me that there's a paradox here where if you dehumanize those that you're trying to control, then in fact you're devaluing them, and there's really no success. And that's why in sport, typically the goal is to honor, the ideal goal is to honor your opponent. Because then we go in and if you win, it's because you were better that day. And so it's kind of interesting. I wonder if you look back and historically and see whether or not in the end devaluing has left those individuals less than who they hoped to be, because they weren't up against something that was more challenging or was up for the battle, so to speak.
Yeah, this is an argument that David Grossman makes with respect to the Vietnam War. There was a great deal of dehumanization in the Vietnam War, and Grossman suggests that because that was a contributing factor to veterans coming back not feeling that there was anything worthy in what they did, and he thinks that in turn was a contributing factor to psychological complications. The problem in war is always, there are many problems in war, but an important problem of war is combat motivation. How do you get people to do horrible, horrible, horrible things? So we have a trade-off there, perhaps. On one hand, aggression needs to be released. Dehumanization is a way that releases lethal aggression. On the other hand, there may be considerations like those that you pointed out. And it's kind of there's a trade-off.
Yeah, sort of relevant to that, I just read this week a piece that the highest incidence of suicide in the Nazi army were the death camp killers when they had to actually shoot prisoners. So they were so happy when the gas chambers came along because then the suicide rate among the Nazis went down because, sure. And it may be, sort of just the point that we've been talking about. It wasn't meeting a worthy opponent on the field of battle sort of thing, but it was this really gross act of looking people in the eye and shooting
them. Yeah, well,
them.
it's up close.
Right.
It's up close. That's terrible. A lot of people in Nazi Germany, they couldn't stomach this stuff at all. Yeah. People in the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile death squads. And actually, we have a kind of mythology about that because we assume, of course, they would be executed. In fact, the Nazi commanders were really quite tolerant of this. People were always given the option. They didn't have to do the dirty work. Psychological clinics, psychotherapeutic clinics were set up to treat, SS men with aching consciences and so on and so forth. And a lot couldn't take it. But yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And the one point I didn't understand in your talk, David, when you said that triathlons, that we dehumanized, because I'm thinking of them as like these super sort of this other point that those are the ultimate athletes.
Well, I know nothing about triathlons, but you will, if you search, you will find articles on that topic. Triathlons dehumanize athletes.
Okay.
So the point being that the term dehumanization is used in a variety of ways, and we really need to be specific about what we mean by it.
You talked a little bit about natural selection in the book.
Yeah, who is speaking?
Right here.
Oh, yeah.
And the thing that I found fascinating was that if there were a peaceful branch and a warlike branch, the peaceful branch long ago got wiped out.
Oh, with that, I'm not sure what you're talking about, actually, what you're referring to in my book. Was this like a thought experiment?
Well, it was, I think, going back when you were talking about the chimpanzees.
Oh, no,
and
but,
and you would have two branches.
Oh, no, but
the warlike ones.
the other peaceful ones were not wiped out. You're referring to the common chimpanzee and the bonobo, Pan troglodytes and Pan paniscus. So these are, genetically, they're equally related to us. You know, chimpanzees generically are our closest living relatives, and one way that scientists try to draw conclusions about our common ancestor is to look at similarities between the chimps and ourselves, on the assumption, and it actually doesn't necessarily follow, this is just conjecture, on the assumption that we both get those traits from our common ancestor. Now, the problem posed here is that the chimpanzee group, there are these two different animals, chimps, who are strikingly similar to us in a number of respects. They're fiercely hierarchical. And for our purposes, what's most interesting is they engage in something like war. That is, they will have organized attacks against neighboring groups. Whereas bonobos, they have been studied less in the wild, and there's a lot of kind of glamorization of bonobos. But generally, bonobos are they're not violent creatures. They engage in a great deal of recreational sex, which humans do as well. Females are dominant amongst bonobos. Males are dominant amongst chimpanzees. Again, that's a generalization, but it generally holds. And so some people want to say, well, the bonobo model is a better way for understanding human beings. We're more like the bonobos. Well, in certain respects we are, but we don't have to look at them. Just look at our history, look at our behavior. And some of our more unpleasant characteristics we see mirrored in the common chimpanzee. Jane Goodall, the great authority on chimpanzees, even suggested that there is a chimp equivalent of dehumanization. Because when the chimps attack other chimpanzees from neighboring groups, they behave the way they do when they're hunting for monkeys, which is a favorite food. So as Goodall suggested, they seem to de-chimpize other chimps.
Hey, David. I've been thinking a little bit about something you said earlier, which you talked about in ancient times. There was an ascription of divine authority.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about that over time, because I have to say in the last 10 years or so, it seems to me like leaders on both sides of the Iraq War also asserted a divine authority,
yes.
and it seems like that hasn't shifted much historically.
Well, I think it has shifted somewhat in that these sorts of things don't produce generally the same level of conviction as they once did. But yes, that is, I believe, is still a very important force.
In your studies, were there any indications that there was dehumanization used during the United States Civil War?
That's a really interesting question, and I haven't found any. I haven't looked very hard, and I would love to speak to a Civil War scholar about that. It's particularly fascinating because of the close relationship between the two sides. I will bet that there was. There was. I will bet that there was.
Okay, so David, I just wanted to ask you maybe to speculate on something that's been bugging me, and it has to do with the current war situation that we seem to be doing this about. You know, it's not really going on. And I'm just wondering, you know, from my retrospect to the Vietnam era, and you had the artists led by John Lennon, saying things like, we're not dehumanizing, doing things like bagism, saying, if you think about it, there is no essence. The bagism was if we all get in a bag, we can't see what cultural diversity we're from. You can't tell our race, as we use that term. And that seemed to strike something of the human chord, saying, yeah, we need to stop dehumanizing and start to raise awareness towards peace. And I guess my question is, what's happened? The artists are all sort of cowering away, or only responding to natural disasters. Oh, well, let's all get together and raise awareness because of the terrible thing that happened because of earthquakes, because we can't control natural disasters. But in the meantime, there's disaster all around us with, we're the nation at war. So I just wonder if you speculated what happened to the peace impulse.
Ask someone else. Ask the sociologist. I don't know.
I wanted to comment earlier on a comment that was made, and it is interesting to me where dehumanizing shows up, and I'm active in the veteran community, and I'd just like to put out there that it's getting to, in referring to post-traumatic stress disorder as PTSD. In fact, it's a lot of people are feeling that it really should just be PTS, because it's really not a disorder. If you can understand sometimes what situation that person that is suffering had to deal with, what's going on is a natural attempt at a healing process. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And another thing that I wanted to comment on in reference to you're talking about distancing from the kill or killing. Although immediately it's not as traumatic, obviously, but what they're finding now, a lot of people that were in the Vietnam War that were able to get out and deal with it by keeping busy, pouring themselves into their careers, and well, now a lot of those folks are retiring, and a lot of veteran centers, across the country are being inundated with people in this situation. And I knew a gentleman that he would say that he was over in Vietnam and didn't have a bad duty. He was in an office all the time. He had a lot of fun doing things. But his office, every paper that authorized a bombing, he had something to do with. So it wasn't directly. But I will say that over time, that severely traumatized him. Now, in your book, you reference the name of the pilot, and I can't bring his name to mind.
Yeah, the Hiroshima guy. Yeah.
Right, and he held firm, to the end that it was the right thing to do. I'd do it again, and all like that. And people do that, but also now they realize, and I've, in talking to members of his family or his kids or some of these people that seem to be able to deal with this in that context, it manifests in other areas of their life. They'll be very distant from their kids, or they're very...
Absolutely. These things are often not obvious. And again, the language of disorder tends to mask that. That is, if people don't have certain symptoms, we conclude that they haven't been harmed. But human nature is a subtle thing. With respect to your first question, I would propose shortening the abbreviation even more to PT. I think stress is a trivializing term.
David, if I may allow myself the last question. Is denigration a form of dehumanization?
It's less than. I mean, one can denigrate another while still regarding them as a human being. In fact, I would have to think this through, but I'm attracted to the conclusion that when we dehumanize, we do not denigrate. The denigration requires some recognition of human status. It's still within the sphere of the human. It's just we're saying someone is imperfectly human or a flawed human being, whereas when we dehumanize, we're removing them from the category of the human. We're putting them, in effect, in the category of the monstrous.
With this wonderful comment, I invite you to join us for some nice food outside and also some drinks. Thank you so much, David. I have one more announcement to make. We have a wonderful series of activities this coming month in March, beginning